All right, I think we had a decent amount of people join, so let's go ahead and get started. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jerry Abbey, Copia's Director of Product Marketing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joe. Hi, everybody. I'm Jerry. I'm just going to advance to our intro slide here. As Joe said, I'm the Director of Product Marketing here, and I'm excited to talk to you today and have this partnership webinar with Claroty. I'm going to hand it over to Gary for his intro.
Yeah, I'm Gary Nealand. I'm one of our principal product managers here in Claroty. We've been covering the industrial space for a lot of years, so it's a very exciting topic. It's something I think is close to both of our hearts, and yeah, interested to go into some of the specifics here.
Cool. And those specifics, our agenda here today, we're going to do an intro of a couple of reports that we're going to dive into. We're going to talk through some of the challenges, pulling out that data and putting it in the context of what we see every day. Then talking through how do we address these many challenges that are out there. And then closing out, thinking about what is industrial DevOps and how can it help? And we're going to put that in the context, bridging out of what Claroty does and give an explainer of how that all operates together, followed by a Q&A. So please bring your questions, submit them throughout. We'll address them as we go. It's always more fun when it's engaging. And all right. So Copia recently published the first annual State of Industrial DevOps report. I'll give you quick background. I've been running industrial reports for a long time. I came over from Rockwell, had been working on the State of Smart Manufacturing report and leading that the last 3 years. So when I came to Copia, I really wanted to get some market research to understand where we are with industrial DevOps and currently just the automation space in OT. And we surveyed very senior executives at very large organizations. Of the 200 respondents, 42% were C-suite titles, and organizations, 58% were over $1 billion in revenue. And we had a wide spread of industry across some of the samples here: high tech, electronic semi, retail, automotive, food and beverage, pharmaceutical, plastics and rubber. Lots of different industries surveyed. Quick hits on the executive summary. We're going to be digging deeper into this later. We got great information around downtime. 67% of the respondents said that it costs over $1 million per hour for downtime. 50% of all downtime was attributed to industrial code. Shifting to the middle column here, looking at some of the focus for this webinar today, the cybersecurity practices. We found a high percentage of organizations are running with ad hoc fixes due to the pressure of downtime. We've seen what I've noticed over the course of doing these surveys for a long time, an increase in where OT decisions are involving your cybersecurity security stakeholders, which is a great positive that came out of here. And 47% of unintended downtime is caused by a cybersecurity breach. The last column, looking at your competitive advantage, we're going to talk through this more later in the presentation. And Gary?
Yeah, and kind of shifting gears here. So, like, why are people having to do these sort of updates and things to their environments? And that's something that I think Clarity has done a lot of research on. And we've recently posted our Global State of the Industrial Cybersecurity Trends. And these are all things that we've been seeing for a long time, right? I think any of you guys in your organizations, especially our operational practitioners, are going to know that the landscape has been changing, right? There's more things that we need to start worrying about when we're talking about industrial cybersecurity. And a big piece of that comes at patching and updating systems. So looking at this, if we look at some of the challenges that we've had our customers see and the trends that we've been seeing in the industry at large, we've seen more and more focus on risk assessments, right? Where do we have issues? And a big cause of these issues is things like unsecure configuration or services or things like that that need to change. Asset and lifecycle management is also a big pending focus. Obviously, we see a lot of old, obsolete equipment in these facilities, and it's something that we need to be focusing on to be able to figure out how we're going to either remediate that, change it out, or put in alternate controls. And vulnerability management, I think, is becoming a larger chunk of what folks are trying to respond with, because they'll go and identify that they have a lot of issues out there. Also, when we talk specifically about attacks and that sort of thing, the respondents to our OT cybersecurity reports were that ransomware was all over the place, right? Whether it's targeted and specific towards their operational environment or something that is on their IT environment. You can see here that 21% of our respondents had just IT. Some had just OT, but the vast majority had both. A lot of times we're seeing things where it's coming from the IT the IT environment over into the OT environment and causing impacts to production. So if we look at the next slide here, we can talk about some of these other higher level numbers. Again, I think security is kind of changing the sort of steps that we need to take. Across our respondents, 95% of CISOs and critical infrastructure are now being responsible for this. I think this is something that is more and more getting board level attention. We see this coming out of the C-suite, and so it's something that has more and more focus. We also see a huge percentage, so almost 70% of OT assets have high-risk vulnerabilities and exposures. A lot of these devices are connected either directly to the internet or have pathways through remote access solutions to less secure networks. We also see an increase in things like ransomware and other attacks. Again, 75% of these organizations are experiencing some type of ransomware attack. And in a lot of cases, Jerry talked about, unplanned downtime with, configuration changes and that type of thing. We see a lot of them also having unplanned downtime because of, cyber attacks or other incidents. So I think it kind of follows here that we are seeing a changing landscape. Obviously, this is something that's impacting a lot of organizations, whether it's strictly on security or configuration management fronts. And so that's what we're going to talk through today. Talk through some of the other ways that we can tackle some of these challenges.
Thanks, Gary. And building off of that, so we're going to dig in a little deeper on the downtime numbers from our State of Industrial DevOps report. So the average for the survey of our 200 respondents was 4.2 million as the cost per hour. And as Jeff Winter, our contributing analyst and editor here, is quoted on the side, unplanned really is that uninvited guest. And when you really look at it, it is a compound interest type comparison where, going back to those hot fixes, which I'll dig into more later, you make one fix, it cascades across your many devices, and while you're under pressure to get back up and running, you have these later issues that you're not addressing that can continue to cause problems. So I mentioned before, 50% of all downtime is attributed to industrial code. When we look at bigger organizations and cut the data for organizations with over 75 locations, that number goes over 60%. So how industrial code is being managed in this space continues to be a pain point, and it's growing as you get more devices, as you think about that exposure that Gary mentioned and the risk that is present there. And on the right-hand side here, you can see that risk in the unplanned downtime, with cybersecurity breaches being the number one cause. And then looking across, you see hardware malfunction and coding and software issues. And really, I want to bring your attention squarely on that coding and software issues, because the level of understanding you have and access to your code, knowing who's changing it, when they're changing it, why they're changing it, how those changes are impacting your hardware and impacting your cyber secure or not secure practices, can make all the difference in the world and can help fix some of those big numbers that we're looking at here, triggering that unplanned downtime. So one of the things when we talk about industrial DevOps is where it comes from. In IT and the software space, since 2009, there have been these set of best practices for managing code. You're using Git-based control, you have automated testing, deployment management, observability, and monitoring. So real visibility and control, which we talk about all the time in manufacturing, all the time in distribution organizations. How can I see what's happening? Going back to that asset risk assessment, what is connected? What is not connected? What is updated? What is not updated? Really being able to dig in and have that understanding of what's going on in your organization. So by contrast, this is what we're currently seeing in the OT environment. A lack of backups, a lot of outdated file storage, so manual, going from device to device with a USB stick or a laptop. Very limited visibility in there, especially going back to thinking about who has access to the industrial code, who's changing it, why they're changing it, and is it exposed? So a lot of conversation the last couple of years has been around the convergence of IT and OT, and I look at industrial DevOps as a bridge for this divide. IT understands DevOps and what it brings to their space, and they have been using it for years. Bringing industrial DevOps, which is focused on that marriage of the cyber and the physical together so that you can have a best practice approach, is a bridge to connect these two groups, these two organizations that often work siloed. And as we talk through the rest of this presentation, I want you to think about how finding that commonality can benefit the teams that you're on, the teams that you're leading, as you approach the future of your organization. There's so much talk about cutting edge technology, the factory of the future, you name it. But to do that, to have best practices, to bring your brownfield environments up to where you need them, it's what is going to help my teams communicate and work together and give me the visibility as we update and move forward.
So to kind of build off of what Jerry was talking about some of the things that they're seeing, making this difference, right? Like if you look at the way we've traditionally done things on the IT side and how it's changing into OT, I think we've seen a lot of those changes as well, strictly coming from the cybersecurity perspective. So again, when we talk about driving change and why we have to tackle some of these problems in a different way, I think we're seeing it again from a strictly security perspective. So again, if we look at just disruptions, I talked about how many organizations are being hit by things like ransomware and that sort of thing. We've seen this not only increasing, but we've seen larger and larger attacks occurring. Again, very large ones like Colonial, a number of very big ransomware attacks here. And these are all things that, again, are elevating this view and raising awareness. This is not trying to make you scared that this is out there. This is just demonstrating that this is something that is getting more and more on the radar. The fact that this is a soft spot for many organizations, and it's something that we need to start tackling. And again, Jerry already outlined some of the differences here when we're talking about like from a DevOps perspective, but it's also something that we have to start treating differently just from a general security perspective as well. Like all the solutions that we bring into this space have to have that context and that sensitivity to what exists in these environments so that we can appropriately service them and meet the operational needs that are out there for these operational facilities. So looking forward a little bit, one of the outcomes of this, not only have we seen an increase in some of these issues, but we're seeing more and more regulations come into the space. This is something that, if any of you guys are like our midstream pipeline friends or in the transportation industry or things like that, Colonial Pipeline recently got us some new TSA regulations around the new TSA security directives around security in these areas. We also have in Europe, the NIS2 directives is changing how they categorize critical infrastructure. So it's bringing more and more into it. We see this globally with global frameworks like IEC 62443, and this is something that I think is going to continue changing. So again, we've seen this in some areas. Anyone coming from power or some of the other regulated industries, this is nothing new. But for some of our friends in other areas of critical infrastructure that don't currently have a regulator, and you don't get the fun of going through these audits, this is something that I think the landscape is going to continue to shift on. And as we see these people entering the space, it does change how we have to respond, right? No longer is it just, we're going to go deploy a security program, but we need to be able to document, validate, report against anything that we're doing so that we can appropriately show that the controls that we're doing, the controls that we're taking, meet these requirements. And again, I think this speaks to some of this unique nature that we have in the operational area that we have to think about when we're considering solutions. Is that we may have a regulatory or audit regime that comes along that we do have to comply with. And when we're thinking about these types of solutions and how we tackle these problems, I think that this is something that should come in and be a part of that decision-making process. One of the other things I wanted to talk about here is, again, Jerry touched a little bit on some of the differences in the solutions. We've talked a bit about the challenge, but why can't we just go take something? Jerry outlined some really great solutions. Everybody knows GitHub, right? You can all go out there. But can we go do that for a bunch of control logics files for our Rockwell PLCs? Same with when we talk broader security stack, right? We have very different footprints of equipment that exists in these environments, right? In the IT environment, it's pretty standardized. You guys all know what sits on your corporate WANs, things like servers, laptops, switches, the regular suspects. In the OT environment, we're looking at very different types of equipment that have very different controls in place, right? We're talking PLCs, controllers, sensors, RTUs, these types of systems that have not only different requirements, but can support different security controls. Same with the reliance on confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Obviously, in OT, safety is number one. We care about our safety and reliability of our process. And we have to keep production. We have to make sure that whatever we're doing is not going to impact with the production of our facilities, and then we can continue doing whatever operation or function that facility is working on. Also, when we look at things like protocols and the security controls we can apply, again, in the IT environment, this is very well worn. Stuff is pretty standardized. If I'm asking you to go apply a new identity system, you can go grab Active Directory off the shelf and be good to go. In the OT environment, that is not the case. A lot of these systems don't support authentication. They don't support encryption. It's just very, very different when we look at what exists in these environments. And we have a lot of, I mentioned this before, but a lot of legacy equipment that we cannot change. You're not going to go take out a multi-million-dollar control system because it has a Windows XP dependency. So we have to deal with these sort of things and operate in what actually exists in these environments. The final thing is just the compatibility. Again, when we look at standard security solutions, they're not really built with this in mind. And there are a lot of key considerations that we need to care about when we're building these sort of deployment models out. So if we look at the current approach, again, I've seen this a lot. I've worked through a lot of customer environments. If we try and go and take in these standard solutions, you can not only be incompatible with what your targets are, but you can potentially introduce risk. Lots of stories of someone going and throwing an ESSA scan or something like that in an OT environment and shutting it down. It's never a fun day. You need to have solutions that can be able to operate in that environment specifically. Also, asset discovery, Jerry mentioned this in his talk, but visibility is normally that starting point that we talk about, and we need something that can give us a complete view of our landscape. Not only to be able to identify risk and threats, but be able to identify areas where we can apply other controls. Again, whether that is updating systems, changing configurations, whatever controls that we're applying to these devices, we need to make sure that we can get that solid foundation so that we can build on top and build out our program effectively. The last thing here, if we're missing those two pieces of data, right, we're not going to get the right insights. We're not going to spend our time in the right places. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that is your guys' most precious resource, especially in these OT spaces. We need to make sure that your teams are spending their time in the right place, that we're actually going out and doing things that is going to move the needle, reduce risk, and do the appropriate actions to ultimately protect the crown jewels, right? Typically, these operational facilities are the things that are making your company money. They're the things that we need to care the most about, and we want to protect that business outcome. The last thing I'll touch on here is just when we look at products and some of the things, I love coming on here with folks like Jerry because our solutions can work so well together where we can identify these sort of changes that you need to make. And because we both have that strict OT context, it allows you to be able to appropriately do those in that environment. Again, keeping in mind this thought of we need to make sure that we're reducing risk. We need to make sure we're not going to impact production. We need to make sure that we're going to do this in a safe manner that is going to, give us the control and give us the security impact that we care about while still meeting these requirements. So again, there are folks out there to help us do this now. Again, that's why folks like Claroty and Copia exist. And I think we'll be able to talk through some of the other ways that we can help, build out some of these more advanced control sets.
Totally. Thank you, Gary. And that is such a great setup for this slide, especially looking at that last point on the right, the lack of cohesion and blind spots. And with that lack of cohesion, I think that's one of those triggers for these ad hoc fixes. You're feeling pressure, you're uncertain, and as Gary mentioned, your money is on the line. You need to get back up and running, keep that operation going. So you do an ad hoc fix. You do a hot fix on the floor, and that resolves the problem. But for how long? Are there blind spots? How many blind spots are there that you have as a result of not just one hot fix, not just two? Look at all of the different devices that are connected in your operation. So in our survey, we asked a lot of different questions to try and really dig in and understand how connected is this OT environment. Very. So we're looking at 14% of our respondents having 10,000 plus devices, 42%, so getting close to half, having over 2,000, and the majority of our survey, 75%, having over 600 devices. So when you're just doing one ad hoc fix, it's never just one. You have so many different devices and it does cascade, and you're going to fix an issue here and then down the chain, another issue is going to arise. You do it again. And then if you think about the layers of that happening across your different parts and pieces, your sensors, your scanners, your drives, your cameras, your robots, everything, and the different people that are working on this and the different shifts. There are so many pieces involved, and when you start to unravel it, it gets a little bit scary. And starting to think about what type of process do you have as changes are made? How are you setting forth a process so that you can get control of what's going on in that OT environment? So we asked, what percentage of people have a code review process? And the majority of our respondents do, which is phenomenal. But we also asked, how much time are they spending a month reviewing the code that's down there, understanding if it's updated, understanding what the updates that are being made are actually doing. And we got 4 hours a month for reviewing. Now, data can be anything you want, and it's really about understanding context. So 99% of people having a code review process in place seems great. 4 hours reviewing code a month could be a positive if you have a really efficient process, which would be ideal. But we also asked, how much time are you spending debugging code? And that's 45 hours, which seems like a very drastic difference when you're only spending 4 hours a month reviewing. If this were to shift a little, could you eliminate some of that rework, unplanned work for your workforce? And I'm not going to dig super into this because we only have an hour, but I think so much about the workforce and the people you have out there and the difficulties that are well tracked in the media and shortfalls in getting workers, the skills gap, people that come in on average for 3 months or a week or a day, and trying to keep cohesion, especially when you have all these many assets across your OT environment, and that continual convergence for connection so that you can do more with what you have and you're being asked to do more with less everywhere. So that's set up some of these challenges, which Gary's going to jump into here.
Yeah, so I was gonna say, like, yeah, now you're thinking, great, Gary, Jerry convinced us this is a challenge. We have these issues. There are unique things that are in our operational environment. Well, what can we do about it, right? So I usually like to think about this in a use case outcome, right? Because no one is going and doing security or doing any of these things because it's fun and they just love it so much. And they're, maybe some of you, right? Like some of you are true believers and you just really, really love updating systems and getting into, playing with configs and all that sort of stuff. But the business has certain things that they care about. And I usually bucket these into a couple of things, right? Cyber resilience is obviously a piece of this, right? They care about being able to deal with either reduce the effect of if an attack occurs or prevent it from occurring in the first place, right? We want to be resilient to some of these so that at least our lowest hanging fruits are not occurring. And when I look at some of the things that organizations I talk to are really looking at when they're like targeting what are we going to do or what are our goals aligned on cyber resilience, it's usually things like setting up a sort of program to evaluate and increase our security posture. Zero trust, I think it's brought up a lot, right? We want to make sure that if we do have an issue, that it will be contained to a single location or a single system, so we don't have a total business impacting issue just because something happened at a single facility, and something to be able to detect and mitigate threats, right? If something happens, I want to know about it and I want to be able to respond to it. These are usually broad strokes, the type of things that we see. But I think paired with any of this needs to come that operational resilience piece, right? It's not just about trying to protect against threats, but at the end of the day, it's about keeping our operations running. That is the goal. That is what all of this is for. And if we look at this, we also get some benefits out of some of this, right? It's not just going to give us these cyber use cases, but we also get some benefits on the operational side as well. So this first is getting an asset inventory or asset management set in place. Again, I came from the plants, and I can tell you switching to something where I get an automated inventory and I can easily tell you where all this flavor of PLC is or where all these switches are versus having to walk it down with a clipboard or an Excel sheet once a month. That is a thing a system engineer loves. Having something that can automatically be updated, like that is a thing that buys in your operational folks. Also, reducing outages, right? Anything that we can do that can reduce the impact, either whether it is the occurrences of outages happening or the impact if one does occur, is things that at the end of the day ends up affecting our bottom line. And this last thing is all around change management, right? Whatever we're doing, whatever process we need to put in place, we need to think about it in this operational framework and make sure that we're doing it in a safe, manageable, and repeatable way. So this is some of the business outcomes that I look at. And when we see customers actually trying to achieve this, what do we see? So Gardner actually did a bunch of research around this, and this was kind of the phases that they set up, and this aligns with what I have seen. Again, I've done tons of assessments and tons of work across a lot of critical infrastructure. And I think a lot of organizations that Claroty sees, that I'm sure Jerry sees with Copia, are still in that awareness phase, right? They know something's happening. They tune into a couple webinars. They're like checking stuff out. They're like, something's out there. I saw this thing on the New York Times. I saw this, attack occur against someone else in our industry. We need to go do something. Or the board comes along and says, hey, we know this is an issue. We need to start focusing on it. Then we start getting into practicing. So this is where we start getting visibility. I think, that is always that key first step. We want to know what we have. We need to identify our devices and start wrapping our arms around the problem. After that, most organizations hit that, oh, wow, or oh, insert your favorite expletive here moments where they realize this is a lot of work. There's a lot of changes we got to make. There's a lot of vulnerabilities, a lot of issues, a bunch of bad configurations we need to go change. And then they quickly enter firefighting mode. So this is where they just start plucking at the lowest hanging fruit, trying to build that out. And just trying to prioritize and figure out what they can do. After that, they start getting into more of a steady state. Okay, we're integrating this into our existing work processes. We're building this into our broader business strategies and optimizing all of this and kind of creating that, repeatable method that you would want with any of these types of programs. So if this is following what your organizations are doing, if you're just starting to see that and you're like, man, we're trying to wrap our arms around this problem and it's really, really tough. This is very common what we see, again, across a lot of organizations. And it is, you are very much not alone. This is something that we see all the time across a variety of industries. So if you're facing that and if you're starting to kind of work your way through that, if we want to look into the next slide, we can look at some of the steps that we can start taking to actually do this journey, right? So again, I think that first step is asset discovery. We need to understand what we have, and we need a method that can do it in a variety of different ways, right? If you look at most production environments, you usually don't have cookie cutter plans from one to the next. You're going to have different architectures. You're going to have different network footprints. It's hard to do a one size fit all solution for that sort of thing. So we need to have something that's going to be able to target the most devices, that can do it in the most flexible manner so that we can create that baseline. And again, whether this is Claroty or anybody else, I would strongly suggest that's where we start for anybody, because we want to be able to at least understand what we have, right? If you're missing areas and there are blind spots, those are the areas where you could where you would potentially have the biggest impact. After that, we want to start building out some of these programs. So again, things like asset management and change management, I think, are very critical. Change management, I think, is something that a lot of times you're going to have to deal with this, right? It's never that simple to go patch things in a production environment, right? If you have to wait for outages or you can't get into a facility for whatever reason. A lot of times you're going to see from the vendor that we have an alternate control in place. There's something that we can change on the device to disable an unnecessary service, change a default user account, whatever it is. There's always things that we can do to start making these updates. And this is all the sort of thing that we want to start doing to be able to prioritize and start making the real impacts that are going to start moving the needle in your facilities. The last thing here that I think a lot of organizations focus on in those early stages are things like remote access. The reason I call this out is if you look at a lot of the real issues that we see in facilities, usually anything that's targeted, a lot of times it's going to be harvested credentials on a remote access solution. I think that's something that I always like to say, you're either going to do remote access in your OT environment and set it up right, or it's going to be done to you by a system engineer throwing go to my PC on an engineering workstation so they don't have to drive out to the plant in the middle of the night, right? It's too easy for people to set these up on their own now. So it's something that we need to be able to do and set up in a secure manner. Because again, this is usually one of the key security areas that we need to worry about when we're looking at setting up a security program. So those are some of the broad strokes. That's, again, what I recommend to anybody. I always do get told on these, I have to at least put at least one slide in here for what Claroty does. So yes, Claroty can do all these things. You don't have to do with Claroty specifically, but we do have a suite of tools to focus on this. Regardless if you're using us or anybody else, I would give the same recommendations, right? We need to start with that asset inventory. We need to create that baseline of what exists out there. Some of the things that are unique about us is, we do have very flexible deployment models to be able to tackle complex and large network architectures. We work across all industrial verticals, so we've seen a lot of different issues out there. And then our tools build into a bunch of different key competency areas. But again, stuff I've been talking about are things like vulnerability and risk, protecting your network environment, real-time threat detection, and then things like change management, remote access. So again, we really follow that same path that we see a lot of organizations take on that Gartner piece to make sure that they can appropriately both identify what their program is going to look like and then start executing on it, regardless of where you're at in the journey.
Thanks, Gary. And that leads perfectly into our next section. I'm going to pause for just a second, though. Joe, have we had any questions come in yet?
Not yet from the audience, so please feel free to keep them coming.
All right. So please, if you have questions, I know we're covering a lot of stuff here. Please dive in with the questions. If you end up not asking any questions, I know that I have a ton of questions and love chatting with Gary. So we can banter at the end of this either way. But if you have questions, put them in there. All right. What is industrial DevOps? And I'm going to give the definition, and then we're going to get into the context, building off of everything that Gary just talked through. So I have it up on the screen, but I'm going to read it just to put it out there into the world a little more. Industrial DevOps is the application of lean, agile, and DevOps principles to the planning, development, manufacturing, deployment, and serviceability of significant cyber physical systems. It's a mouthful, but you have your physical systems, you have all of the cyber, the software that is layering across your operations, and it takes a specific, specialized approach to make that successful when you bring DevOps into it, these best practices from the IT world. And just a quick history piece here. Manufacturing and IT have been borrowing from one another for decades. And when I talk about that IT-OT bridge, bringing them together so that it's no longer being talked about as a divide, I look at the history and the change that has come from Eli Goldratt writing the goal and putting out the theory of constraints to software developers reading that and saying, this is a pretty good idea. Looking at the Toyota production system and the way that they brought in lean and simplicity to unite teams so that they are not walled off and divided. These are at the core base practices that help with change management that Gary was talking about. You get people on board because you clarify that goal, the mission that has been written about since the beginning of business. And you equip people with the right tools to move forward. And very much so, that next phase I look at as industrial DevOps. And you can see here in the lower right, Frost and Sullivan is writing about it as a growth opportunity for industrial automation because they recognize the proliferation of all of these different devices that are all running on code, and putting in that foundation for your organization to work from that's going to instill the rigor that Gary talked about, the visibility into what you're doing, just getting that baseline of what assets do we have running and moving from there. It's a great place to start. It's a basic place to start, and there's lots of ways to start doing that. So my next slide, one of the things I was just touching on a little bit is industrial DevOps puts people at the center. Anything that puts people at the center is going to help trigger an easier time with change management because they're going to feel empowered. They're going to, and this all comes from Deming and from before, but thinking about Dr. Deming laying out how do you do automation? You focus on the process before you do anything, and putting people at the center of being able to review that process, understanding what makes sense from an automation perspective, and then pushing forward with continuous improvement. You've created this virtuous loop for improvement and understanding. And while there's so much talk about the factory of the future, and that's an ideal space and typically a greenfield space, the reality is that we're working in brownfield spaces, and how do we update those for the future? And that's a lot of what Gary's talked about and I've touched on here. And I really couldn't drive this point home enough. It's focusing on your people and helping to empower them to bring that change about and tackle it one piece at a time. So in our survey, we asked, after defining and explaining what industrial DevOps is, as clearly as I did there, maybe even clearer, and 97% of our respondents said that they were psyched. They were like, absolutely, industrial DevOps will help my team. I put this picture in there a little bit for humor, but really just to emphasize, like this guy in the blue sweatshirt, they're psyched. This is awesome. If it can deliver half the benefits that I think it can, it's going to benefit my team. And then, as always, there's challenges. There are so many competing priorities. No surprise that that was number one here for pursuing a DevOps-oriented approach in your industrial automation. You have so many huge bucket initiatives. It really depends on what the board is saying, what your CEO is driving towards, what the 5 and 10-year outlook is, or if you were recently hit by a ransomware attack and you were just trying to get things up and running again and trying to figure out what is the next phase. Then there's the lack of interest or budget or a lack of apparent need. There's apathy within the environment as well. And that is where change management comes in. And webinars like this to share the information that we have so we can help, hopefully, spur change and support you with some data to make that argument. And just want to call out this last point here. If you haven't found a technology that can take a DevOps-oriented approach, we're right here, and we are happy to help you. So please reach out. The last point on this slide, though, is I don't want anyone to get caught sleeping, because first movers see the advantage with industrial DevOps in the cyber-physical space, especially as cybersecurity becomes that board level CISO-driven point. And I have some questions for Gary later that I'm going to be touching on this one. But people are moving, and it's important to be thinking how you can bring industrial DevOps into your operation to build off what you're doing. And if you have asset identification in place, it is a great next step, because now you know what assets there are, and you can start addressing, updating, and making sure that everything is visible and in one place. Going back to those competing priorities, I just want to call out some other data that we have here that may be helpful for you and may spur a little bit of urgency. I've been running industry surveys for over 15 years. I can tell you that even when you try to put a question in a survey that is a softball to drive up a high percentage, it is near impossible. That's to set the stage for this 91%. This was a surprise to me. 91% of people said that the way that they are approaching industrial code is positively impacting their competitiveness. This is statistically impossible. Everyone can't be competitively differentiated by the way that they are doing something. What's more, Almost 60% of our respondents said that version control and configuration management is easy. I'm confused why these responses would be in the same survey as people that are spending 45 hours a month debugging code, reworking code, working on unplanned work, and thinking about how that's affecting their teams within the OT environment when there are so many pressing priorities to be working on. And you have that looming 4.2 million per hour or whatever your cost per hour of downtime is, putting pressure on them to manage hundreds, if not thousands of devices in a cyber secure way that's meeting regulations that will be able to meet the audits that are upcoming. There's a lot going on. And when you look at industrial DevOps, you see it amplifies the impact of your workforce. So these are the numbers from our study. There's also a great book out there, Industrial DevOps, Build Better Systems Faster by Dr. Suzette Johnson and Robin Yeaman, that digs real deep into how industrial DevOps has been applied over the last decade plus, and it can give you more understanding of this impact on work. But it is hugely impactful, proven, and tons of information out there to support that. This other bucket here, 90%, responded that they think cloud-based technologies should be used in the OT space. And this goes back to the remote access that Gary was talking about. People are going to figure out a way to have remote access. And our respondents here are recognizing that a responsible cloud approach can enable that remote access, amplify your attraction to the workforce because they're able to access things remotely, and able to function and collaborate as a team, especially with the dispersed workforce, and looking at aggregation across your plants so that you can standardize and bring your many brownfield plants up to speed together in a unified way and not having siloed teams. It's just another piece there that can help. So we saw earlier that industrial DevOps, the number one cause of unplanned downtime was cybersecurity breaches, and industrial DevOps can help address that. These are some of the responses here on the right from our respondent pool, talking about how it can do it. And compliance with cybersecurity standards right there at the top, the data integrity. And it really, I think that one of the biggest baselines is just that visibility into the assets that are connected, if they're updated, and the control over who's accessing your industrial code, who's changing it, and change tracking, understanding what was changed, why it was changed, when it was changed. So important. And with that, we're going to move into Q&A. And if there are no questions, I have a lot of questions, and Gary and I can just chat.
We have a few, Jerry, here.
Nice.
Cool. So let's jump in this one. Looks like it's for Gary. Where do most organizations start if they're just beginning to do OT cybersecurity?
Yeah, so I think it kind of does follow with what I was showing in the Gartner piece there. They really do start throwing something in there to try and get some visibility. Again, trying to wrap your arms around the solution. I see a lot of people talk about like trying to tackle projects like segmentation or like network refreshes and that type of thing. I can tell you in practice, that's a really great security control, but it can be very hard to do in production if you don't know what's there. It's, especially on big network changes, like it's really easy to break stuff if you don't know all the systems and all their interconnectivity. So again, usually I see it as you start getting some visibility, you start doing some active risk reduction, you figure out places you can patch, places you can change configurations, places you can apply alternate controls. Like usually those are some of the first steps. And then from there, you would start building on to the program. So I don't think it's something that ever really ends, unfortunately. Like you're always kind of towering up more. But that's where I've seen most organizations going.
Thank you. We'll stick with you. I think one more question here for you is what are the most effective security controls you can apply in the OT environment?
So most effective, again, I mentioned segmentation, even though it's hard, I think it is really effective. It's because it can be hard to patch stuff. Another thing I always like to talk about is apply security controls that exist on your product. I mean, this is one of the reasons that I really like Copia and working with folks like Jerry, because there's a lot of systems that if you go change their config and enable certain controls, like you can disable services, you can change things that can seriously increase your security without needing to go buy anything, without needing to go change stuff. You don't need to go totally re-architect your network or anything like that. Like it's stuff that you've already paid for in these products. You just need to use them. So that's another one that I always like to have folks look at. But yeah, if we look at some of the most effective, I think network controls, I think active monitoring, the sort of stuff that Claroty does, I think is always good because even with the best controls, we still need to be able to detect if something's going on in the environment. And then again, just enabling some of those controls that already exists in the products that you already have, and being able to maintain some of that configuration.
Great. Thank you. Have a question for Jerry here. How do you get IT and OT to work better together?
Great question. And I think finding that common ground, and I see industrial DevOps as one way to get everybody bought into a common vision. You have these set of best practices. As I said, there's tons of data out there. If you need to build your data case, we can help with that. But building a bridge of commonality is the basis of change management, of operational effectiveness, of successful teams. Um, and if you can use that, show that you are in good faith trying to do your best and bringing in something that can help drive the best outcomes for both orgs, it's a great way to unify that vision and pull people together into the future because that is the future of manufacturing, the future of distribution, the future of industry. The IT and OT teams are converging, as everyone has been talking about. And if they are not operating effectively and given the same tools, and the wall is not brought down between them, it's going to be really challenging to maintain a competitive edge, to be effective, and certainly to be cyber secure.
Great. And then last question we have, if any people have any other questions, feel free to continue to ask. But last one I have here is, I think for Jerry as well, how do you see the industrial DevOps landscape changing in the next 5 to 10 years?
Great question. One of my favorites. I see it continuing to advance. So I mentioned the first followers have moved, and now we're going to see the first movers have moved, and we're going to see fast followers coming in. Those organizations that just wait a little bit, want to see that this is a legitimate thing that can have a positive impact on the org, and they're going to be moving. They're moving right now. This year, we're seeing a lot of action on our buyer side, our customer side, and we're also seeing it in the analyst community. I was talking to L&S Research today, who have an amazing industrial transformation architecture that lays out how the different technologies blend together. And I was talking to them about the section where they identify DevOps and the growth of industrial DevOps in that area to help stabilize and amplify the impact of the other technologies that these organizations are bringing in to drive transformation. And seeing the analysts get excited about that, and I've talked to many others as well, we also see more writing about it. ABI Research just published a piece highlighting Copia and the movement within industrial DevOps. Frost and Sullivan, I highlighted earlier today, and we're going to see more from them. And that's how DevOps got moving as well. Forrester and Gartner called the mainstream of it about 6 or 7 years out after DevOps started. Right now, we're 4 or 5 years into industrial DevOps, and we're seeing this great traction with companies, those first movers. We're seeing the analyst community respond, and I think everyone is going to have an industrial DevOps approach within the next 5, 7 years. I wouldn't even say 10, because of the speed with which technology is moving and how this addresses such a critical space.
Great. Well, thank you, Gary and Jerry. I think those were all the questions we had from the audience.
Can I jump in with one? Sorry. Before we started, Gary and I were talking about the Claroty conference with a lot of senior level people last week. And Gary, sorry to put you on the spot, but are there any big takeaways from the conversations you had last week? Anything that drives home the point more of what we talked about, or was a unique finding for our audience to think about?
Yeah, something that I took away that I thought was really interesting is that you see the same thing everywhere. Like, even though everybody has such different architectures, you're doing such different things. Like, we had CISOs from power, from transportation, from water, wastewater, manufacturing, like all over the place from around the globe. You know, this is a large confluence conference with lots of different customer profiles. And it really is the same thing. Another thing that I think is really interesting is that, especially if you're up in these, if you're up in like the sea level, like people are a lot more open than I expected. Like, they're willing to talk to competitors at the C-suite level about what they're doing, how they're protecting it. Like, at the end of the day, the mission is the same, right? Like, yes, you may be competing someone on a commercial outcome, but you're trying to protect your infrastructure against an attacker, right? The true bad guys are the same for everybody. And so that I thought was something that was really interesting. So hopefully it can leave you with a little bit of hope. Like, there's help out there. There's a lot of organizations like obviously Claroty and Copia that are working to solve these problems. And I think even in industry, like, people are willing to have these conversations. Like, building up those networks, I think is can really help. So
Cool. Thank you.
yeah.
And thanks to everybody that stuck with us. I really appreciate you. I hope the information we brought to you today was helpful, and please reach out to Gary or I in the future if you have any questions after this.